Hello, everybody. My name is Caleb Woodland, and I've been playing a lot of baseball recently, and it's got me thinking a lot about the concept of free will. And I know it might be hard to see the correlation at first, but bear with me. It would be kind of comforting to know that I'm not a free agent and therefore responsible every time I strike out or overthrow somebody. Even though I know my coach wouldn't accept that as an excuse, it would be comforting. It would be nice to know that I'm not responsible for that. But take a moment to think about that. What if we really didn't have free will? For a lot of people, it might be kind of scary to consider the concept that we aren't actually in control of anything in our lives. I mean, our legal system, basically any structure within our society is built around the concept of free will. Sadly, though, it's all a sham. It's an illusion, as many philosophers have described it. Now, over the course of this video, I'll be trying to convince you that free will doesn't exist. Many of you might recognize this position in philosophy. It's called determinism. But first, I'd like to start off with some definitions. Now, the first term that I'd like to define for you guys is called libertarian free will. In philosophy, it's a position that in essence asserts that some of our actions are within our conscious control. It is the position that I will be refuting over the course of this video. Notice how I specified some actions are within our control. People who defend libertarian free will don't necessarily believe that every action is within our complete conscious control. Sneezing, for example, is an example of an action that isn't necessarily free, or being robbed at gunpoint and being forced to hand over your money. There aren't necessarily refutations of libertarian free will, because not even the most fervent defender of free will would assert that sneezing or being robbed at gunpoint is a free decision. They only assert that some actions are within our conscious control. I also like to clear up what free will is not. Free will is not simply the ability to do whatever you want. Being able to do whatever you want is already a conditional statement that is a hindrance to your free will. You're essentially saying, oh, you can do this as long as you want. People who defend free will assert that you can do anything, even if you don't want to do it. If the definition of free will was just to be able to do whatever you want, then I would believe in free will. And I'll get into later in the video the nuances of wants and desires. But for right now, I have to establish that free will is not simply the ability to do whatever you want. Now, there is a philosophy that does try to redefine free will that is kind of centered around doing what you want, and it's called compatibilism. And that's probably a topic for another video, but in this video, the position I'll be refuting is libertarian free will. Now, libertarian free will, as many of you might know, is an essential component of many religions, but especially the world's three major religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, specifically related to concepts such as atonement for sin, penitence, and hell. Libertarian free will is also very distinct from libertarianism, the political philosophy. There are very different ideologies. Libertarian free will is just a position that metaphysically we exert a degree of control over some of our actions. Libertarian free will is a topic for another video if you guys want it, but they're two different things. Libertarian free will can also be defined as if you rewound the clock of time, you could have gotten a different outcome. That if we were to go back to the 1900s, for example, and restart the course of history, we could have a completely different world than the one that we have right now, because we could have acted differently. We could have brought about a different outcome. Now, this is completely at odds with the position that I'll be defending in this video. It's called determinism, as I said earlier in the video. Determinism is essentially the view that, on the flip side, if you rewound time, you could not have gotten a different outcome, that all of our actions are simply the result of a causal chain of events that led to this very moment. Now, what I'll essentially be trying to convince you guys of over the course of this video is that all human action is predetermined. That is determined by external, internal, it doesn't matter, causes that are completely without our control. It doesn't matter if they come from within us or some environmental factors. It doesn't matter because none of them are within our control, and therefore we do not have free conscious control over our own actions. Now, a defender of libertarian free will might assert that my decision to pick up this book, for example, which I'll talk about later in the video, was a completely free decision that was not determined by external or internal causes. Maybe the internal cause was myself, but I'm complete control over that decision to pick up the book. That the decision to pick up that book originated from me in my head at the moment I decided to. But take a moment to think about the implications of that. Is this not completely at odds with some of the neurological and psychological findings that have been coming out? That's exactly where free will runs into an issue. And right now, I'll begin starting the philosophical approach to debunking free will. Now, like I just said, free will really runs into an issue when it starts talking about decisions simply popping into people's head at the moment that they decide to do something. Like, what causes somebody to pick up a book rather than picking up a pencil, or choose oatmeal rather than a banana for breakfast in the morning? What causes these decisions? Now, free will doesn't have an answer to these questions, but determinism does. And there are really only two premises that I need to convince you of in order to prove determinism. The first being all conscious and volitional actions are motivated by our desires, and the second being we cannot control our desires. And think about the first premise for a second. Human beings really are selfish creatures. Any action that we commit is because of the pleasure that we believe that we will procure upon committing the action, or the pleasure that we believe will be greater than the consequences of not committing the action. This is because human beings, we're animals, right? We're ultimately controlled by our genes. And our genes have an innate desire to live and reproduce in the gene pool as much as possible. And that is what causes us to solely act because we desire to act. The reason that I chose to sit down and record this video, for example, is because I wanted to, because I like philosophy and I think making this video will make me happy. The reason you chose to click on this video was because you like philosophy and you thought you might get something out of this video. You chose to watch this video because you wanted to. While you think about that, I'll address two analogies that people have tried to employ to try to refute this first premise. The first being a gym analogy, which I'll go over right now. The gym analogy essentially points to the fact that a lot of people go to the gym even though they don't necessarily want to. That going to the gym doesn't bring them pleasure. They don't always enjoy going to the gym, but they do it anyway. They work out even though it brings them a lot of pain and suffering. But take a moment to actually think about why people go to the gym. People go to the gym because they want to go to the gym more than they want to experience the consequences of not going to the gym. Think about what happens if you don't go to the gym. You have a traditionally unattractive physique, you'll be unhealthy, and all the other consequences. People want to go to the gym instead of having to experience those. So in general, there still is a net desire to go to the gym. You want to go to the gym because you want to be healthy. You want to have a conventionally attractive physique, all that stuff. It is still motivated by desire, by pleasure. I know I've given you guys a lot to think about over the course of this video, but really take a moment to think about a situation where that wouldn't apply, where there really is a situation where you do something despite not actually wanting to do it. Think about the principle I've applied with the gym analogy, where there is a net desire. Think about where there isn't a net desire. It doesn't exist. There is no example. All action is motivated by your desire. The second analogy is a soldier analogy, and it essentially sets up a group of soldiers who's, depending on the version you're hearing, behind a wall, right? And an enemy throws a grenade over this wall, and it's live. And one soldier jumps over the grenade, sacrificing himself and his own life to save his fellow soldiers. And this analogy is supposed to show that sometimes people don't necessarily do things because they want to, but for the virtue of committing the action. That sometimes we do things not because it brings us pleasure or we desire to do it, but because the action is virtuous, and it's virtuous to do the action. But again, really think about why the soldier might have jumped over that grenade. There are two ways that you could really go about approaching this. You could say the soldier did it out of muscle memory. It was simply ingrained into him through reflex. And like I said, if you rewind, I specifically emphasize conscious and volitional actions are motivated by desire. I don't think something but like sneezing or putting your hands down when you're about to fall is motivated by desire. It's simply reflex or muscle memory. Now, if that's the case with the soldier, then that doesn't refute what I'm saying at all. It would be muscle memory. But even if he did take a moment to consciously decide to jump over that grenade, I still don't think it would necessarily refute what I'm saying. Think about what might happen if he didn't jump over the grenade. Himself, the soldier, he might have died. He would have had to live with the guilt of letting his fellow soldier die. He might have had life-ruining injuries. He might have been an amputee. All these other sorts of consequences that come with not jumping over the grenade. And again, like with the gym analogy, his desire to not live with those consequences, that guilt, the amputations, outweighed his desire to live, and is still an action motivated by desire, so it doesn't refute what I'm saying. Now I can move on to my second premise, that we cannot control our desires. Think about how absurd it would be if we really did have complete control over our desires. Would somebody wake up one day and be like, for the rest of my life, I'm going to decide to like basketball. I'm going to decide to enjoy watching baseball. Nobody does this. Our desires are ultimately ingrained into us, whether it be by our environment, through genetics. They're simply put into us by factors that we aren't in control of. Like I said, nobody just decides, I'm gonna enjoy coffee. I'm gonna enjoy pizza for the rest of my life. Your tastes, your enjoyments, your hobbies, all of those are put into by factors that you aren't in control of. If desires really are something that you have complete control over, do it right now. Manipulate your desires in such a way that, think about something that you don't want, right? And try to want it. Or think about something that you really, really do want and try not to want it. Go ahead. I see you trying. It's not going to work. It's never going to work. You can't do that. It just doesn't work that way. Our desires are something that we aren't in control of. They're ingrained into us through our environment, through genetics, whatever it may be. We just don't control over them. And that leads us to the conclusion of the syllogism specifically, not the whole video. Don't click away. If we do not have control over our desires, and all of our action is motivated by our desires, how can you possibly say that we have freedom? Like I said earlier in the video, I said if free will was simply the ability to do whatever we want, then I would believe in free will, because I do believe that we can do whatever we want. I just don't think we can want whatever we want. And where's the freedom in that? It makes no sense to say that we have control over our actions if they're completely determined by factors, or desires specifically, that are not within our control. You can put it into simple modus tollens. If I have a person who will commit action X, if they desire to commit action X, and they do desire to commit action X, they will commit action X. You cannot get around that. You cannot rewind the clock of time and get a different outcome. The only thing that could change the outcome of a situation is a change in one of the premises. And that's why you just don't have control over your actions. Our desires are constantly pulling the strings on our lives. We live in subservience to our desires. We cannot consciously change them. They change us. It is not the other way around. They are in control of us and our actions. Now, I'd like to take a moment to revisit going over some objections to determinism. Specifically, I'll start off with, people say all the time, but you chose to do that. Nobody did that for you. Nobody forced you to do that. Therefore, it was a free decision because you chose to do so. Now, I don't deny this. I don't deny that on any given action, you might choose to do something. I choose to pick up my phone right now. But there's a difference between will and free will. I don't deny that we have will, that we make actions, that we make choices in our lives. I just deny that these actions are free, that we make free choices over the course of our lives. Again, we have will, but not free will. I've also heard people use the fact that sometimes our desires change over time to maybe suggest that we do have control over our desires. For example, somebody might want pizza in one instance, but a salad in another, and they don't want pizza. But even if this was true, which it is, this doesn't mean that we have control over our desires. The changes in our desires that happen all the time, I don't deny that. They happen, but we aren't in control of them. If I want pizza in one instance, but not in another, that's not my doing. I didn't choose not to want pizza in the second instance. I just didn't want pizza. That's how it is with any decision. Nobody consciously decides, I'm going to want pizza from X to Y and then not want pizza from Y to Z. It doesn't work like that. In order to change a want into a don't want or vice versa, you'd have to want to change it. In order to want to change it, you'd have to want to change it. In order to want to change it, you know where I'm going with this. We just don't do this. We're not in control of this never-ending chain of wants. They're just ingrained into us by our environment, by biology, whatever it may be. We just aren't in control of them. Any change in our wants is ultimately determined by unconscious brain activity that we, again, aren't in control of. Because, like I said earlier, all action is motivated by our desires. So, in order to change a want, you'd have to desire to change the want. In order to desire to change the want, so on and so on. Now, if none of this philosophical jargon has convinced you yet, let me throw some neurology at you. In 1983, the physiologist Benjamin Libet used an EEG machine to famously show that activity in the motor cortex of the brain can be detected up to 300 milliseconds, up to before a person decides that they have freely chosen to move, before they feel as though they made a conscious decision to make a hand gesture, specifically in the study. In the study, he wired up the participants to an EEG machine and he put a timer in front of them. And he asked the participants to consciously make a hand gesture and report to him the time that they believed that they consciously made the decision to make that hand gesture. And their brain activity was recorded by the EEG machine. According to the abstract of the study, the onset of cerebral activity clearly preceded by at least several hundred milliseconds the reported time of conscious intention to act. Now, in layman's terms, what this study is showing is that the EEG machine can detect activity, unconscious brain activity in your brain before you decide to move. That before a decision enters your consciousness, before you feel as though you've consciously decided to make an action, unconscious brain activity has already determined the outcome of it. That you can detect the brain activity, unconscious, again, before you even decide to move. Now, the study did receive its fair share of criticisms. So in 2008, Chung Seung-soon conducted a similar study where he wired up participants to an fMRI machine. And he attached two buttons to their left and right index fingers. And he asked the participants to freely choose and then immediately press one of the two buttons. And again, the fMRI machine recorded their brain activity. Now, the results of the study were extremely similar to Libet's, and according to the abstract of this study, the outcome of a decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. Furthermore, this delay presumably reflects the operation of a network of high-level control areas that begin to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. Now, I'd like to emphasize this point again. How can one possibly argue that our decisions are free, within our control, or undetermined when they are produced entirely from unconscious brain activity over which we exert no control? The motor activity that was detected in Libet's study was absolutely not within the participants' control. It was unconscious. It completely flew under the radar of their awareness. So I'd like to ask all of you, if our actions are completely determined by unconscious brain activity over which we have no control, how can you possibly argue that we're free? Where is the freedom in all that? It's nowhere to be found. And again, I'd really like to revisit what would have to be true if we did have free will. For one, we'd have to be completely aware of every single influence that might motivate our desires or actions. And two, we'd have to be in complete control over these influences. Because if our actions and desires are determined by factors that we don't have control over or that we're unaware of, then there's no freedom in that. They're determined by these factors over which we exert no control. Now, besides the fact that neither of those things are true, they're not even possible. I mean, as humans, we are only aware of a tiny, tiny fraction of the information that is constantly being fed into our brains. Now, we can be aware of the moment-to-moment changes in our experiences through thought and mood, for example. Like, we might notice that I want pizza again in one instance, but not in another. We can be aware of that. But again, this change in experience is not a result of us. We aren't in control of that change in experience. Now, I feel like I've sufficiently proven my point that free will is an illusion and determinism is ultimately true. I know this video might be hard to believe for many, and it certainly was for me at first to grasp the concept of free will. I mean, right now, it even feels as though I certainly made a free decision, an undetermined decision, to sit down and press record on this video. It doesn't feel like this action was determined ultimately by unconscious brain activity or factors that I'm not in control of. It feels as though the decision originated from me in my brain and nothing else. But I had to really step back from these biases that I'm born with. We're all born with the illusion of free will. Like I said myself, it feels like I'm making free decisions. And I know all of you probably feel like that too. But again, I had to step back from this bias and truly reflect on my actions, what determines them, and what would have to be true in order for us to have free will. And also consider the arguments for determinism, as I hope all of you are doing right now. Where I believe the illusion of free will ultimately originates from, and as Sam Harris argues in his book Free Will, which I can't recommend enough, it's a phenomenal book. But what the illusion of free will really originates from is the fact that unconscious brain activity determines our actions. This brain activity completely flies under the radar. We are completely unaware of it because, again, it's unconscious. So when the decision does pop into our heads, it feels as though it popped into our heads on our own accord in the moment, that it was something that we decided to do, even though it was completely determined by unconscious brain activity, again, that we are unaware of. Now, I feel like I can start wrapping up this video. Thank you all for watching. And I know you may have noticed this is the very first video on my page, and that's for a reason. That was deliberate. And that's because my views on free will really form the basis of so many of my other philosophical positions that I'll be discussing in later videos. And I'd love to hear you guys' suggestions for what you guys want to hear me talk about in later videos. So put that in the comments. Stay tuned for future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.